Why it feels like the West hates Africa. Why does it feel like the West hates Africa? Why do Europe and the United States, powers that shout about democracy and freedom, keep undermining Africa's sovereignty? Why is it that whenever Africa tries to rise, there's always sabotage, sanctions, or smear campaigns? The truth is this: the West doesn't hate Africa because Africa is weak. The West fears Africa because Africa is powerful. Africa is the continent of 1.4 billion people, sitting on 30% of the world's minerals, 65% of its arable land, and the youngest population on Earth. Imagine if all of that was united, independent, and controlled by Africans. The balance of world power would flip overnight. But the West can't let that happen. So instead, what looks like hatred is really a mix of greed, fear, racism, and control. Today, we're breaking it all down. The colonial system was built to bleed Africa dry. The fear of losing Africa's resources. The deep racism baked into Western thinking. The endless divide and rule playbook. And the geopolitical panic as Africa turns to China, Russia, and itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Africa has always been treated this way and why the future might finally break this cycle. Why it feels like the West hates Africa. Colonial legacy: control, not partnership. Let's start at the root: colonialism. For centuries, Africa was seen by Europe as nothing more than a resource mine and a human reservoir. First came the transatlantic slave trade, ripping millions of Africans from their homelands to fuel Western wealth. Then, the infamous scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, where Europe carved up the continent like a pie at the Berlin Conference. But here's the thing most people miss: colonial systems weren't designed to develop African societies. They were designed to extract wealth. The roads, railways, and schools Europe built? They weren't for Africans. They were for exports: gold, cocoa, diamonds, uranium flowing to Europe. Africa became a farm and a mine for European empires. Even after independence in the 1950s and 60s, the system didn't end. It just changed shape. The West designed neo-colonial relationships where Africa was politically independent but economically dependent. Loans from the IMF and World Bank came with brutal strings attached: cut social spending, open markets, sell resources cheap. Aid was never charity, it was a leash. And let's not forget France's infamous CFA franc system, where 14 African nations still have their currencies tied to Paris, decades after independence. That's not partnership. That's control. So when Africans look at their underdeveloped economies, their crumbling infrastructure, and the fact that their richest resources still leave the continent with almost no local processing, it feels like hatred. But it's really a system built to keep Africa dependent. Resource dependency and fear of loss. Here's the ugly truth: Africa isn't poor. Africa is rich. The problem is who controls that wealth. Africa has 70% of the world's cobalt, essential for electric vehicle batteries. It has 40% of global gold reserves, 90% of platinum, and massive uranium deposits that power Europe's nuclear plants. And let's not forget oil in Nigeria, Angola, Libya, and gas across Mozambique and Algeria. If Africa fully controlled these resources, if African nations stopped exporting raw materials for pennies and instead built their own industries, the West's industrial machine would collapse. And that's why Western powers panic whenever an African leader talks about independence. Remember Patrice Lumumba in Congo? He wanted Congolese resources to benefit Congolese people. He was assassinated in 1961 with Western complicity. Remember Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso? He pushed for self-reliance, land reform, and women's rights. He was assassinated in 1987, with French fingerprints all over the coup. Remember Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana? He dreamed of a united Africa, with one currency, one army, one market. He was overthrown in a coup widely seen as CIA-backed. Whenever Africa tries to stand, the West cuts its legs. Why? Because the West fears losing its supply of cheap resources. It's not hatred. It's fear. Fear of what happens if Africa stops feeding the global machine and starts feeding itself. Racism and superiority. But it's not just about resources. It's also about how the West sees Africa. For centuries, Western ideology justified slavery and colonialism by declaring Africans less civilized, less intelligent, or even less human. Those lies sank deep into Western culture and they never fully died. Today, you still see it in the media narrative. When Africa appears on Western screens, it's famine, war, or corruption. Rarely innovation, progress, or leadership. You see it in the Africa Needs Saving charity ads, where Westerners are the heroes and Africans are helpless victims. You even see it in policy. Western governments often treat African leaders like children, lecturing them on democracy, while backing coups when it suits their interests. This isn't always conscious. But it's there, a superiority complex. And it fuels a subtle contempt. Even when aid is sent, it often comes wrapped in paternalism, not respect. So yes, Africans feel hated because the West still views Africa through racist, outdated lenses. Divide and rule, forever. Here's one of the West's oldest tricks: divide and rule. During colonialism, borders were drawn to split ethnic groups and fuse rivals, guaranteeing tension. After independence, the West kept playing the same game. They backed coups. They armed rebel groups. They meddled in elections. Anything to keep Africa weak and divided. Why? Because a united Africa would be unstoppable. Imagine 1.4 billion people, trillions in resources, and one common market. That's a global superpower bigger than Europe or the US. But as long as Africa is fractured into 54 states, with rival leaders and competing economies, the West can control it piece by piece. That's why leaders who call for unity like Nkrumah, Gaddafi, or even today's Ibrahim Traoré face so much pressure, coups, or outright assassination attempts. Division is profitable for the West. Unity is terrifying. Geopolitical competition. And now, in the 21st century, the game is shifting. China is building railways, ports, and trade deals across Africa. Russia is offering military aid and grain. Turkey, India, Brazil, and the Gulf states are moving in. For the first time in centuries, Africa has options. And the West hates that. Instead of accepting African independence, Western powers are doubling down. Sanctions against governments that reject them. Propaganda campaigns painting African leaders as dictators if they resist Western control. Military bases and drone operations across the Sahel, supposedly to fight terrorism but also to secure influence. The West frames it as protecting democracy. But Africans see it as the same old control in a new disguise. What's really happening is this: Africa is becoming the biggest battleground of the 21st century. The West wants to keep it in its orbit. China and others want to pull it away. And Africa itself is starting to say, we choose ourselves. The bottom line. So let's return to the question, why does it feel like the West hates Africa? It's not about hate like anger between people. It's about a system built on greed, wanting Africa's resources. Fear of losing dominance. Racism, seeing Africans as less capable. Control, keeping Africa dependent. To Africans, this feels like hatred because it crushes dreams, sabotages progress, and undermines sovereignty. But here's the good news: that system is breaking. The youth of Africa, the youngest continent in the world, are rising. Leaders are speaking boldly about sovereignty. New alliances are being formed beyond the West. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a step toward economic unity. And slowly, the narrative is shifting. Africa isn't a victim. Africa isn't weak. Africa is powerful. The West doesn't fear Africa because it's broken.